Hey, thanks for joining me today.
No, thank you, Chris. It's nice to be here.
What's your name?
John Greene.
And what's your official title or position right now in terms of your work?
Well, I wear many hats, but I suppose my main one is I'm director of the Mercury Internet School of Psychological Astrology, MISPA, which is here in the UK, but it's an online school. So we have students worldwide.
Okay. And your primary thing is psychological astrology, right?
Yes, that's correct. We're sort of changing what we do all the time as there are new discoveries, as people research more into the past. So I'd say it's probably already moved on from what we originally set it up as. And, I'm trying to make it a more sort of fully rounded astrological school, but with the focus coming from the psychological.
Sure. And in terms of the history, your school, it's not a spin-off, but it's somewhat loosely connected with the Center for Psychological Astrology, right?
Yeah, well, I suppose we could call it a sister school or something like that. I mean, I can explain the history, which is I personally studied under the CPA, Centre for Psychological Astrology, when it was based in London and just doing London classes. And I took my diploma there and then started teaching for them not that long afterwards, actually, and I was teaching their diploma. Then a few years passed, and Liz Greene, who was the director of the school, decided that she didn't want to run diploma courses anymore. So she was happy to run seminars and talks, but didn't want to be in the sort of formal process of exams and judging what people did and what level they were. So she took that step, and it meant there was no longer a diploma course in the UK or the EU, on psychological astrology.
And that had existed for like 30 years, since the 1980s, right?
That's right, yes. She'd set that up in the 1980s with Howard Sasportas. And so I started teaching the foundation course for that school as an online course. And we were getting an awful lot of interest, from people that knew about the CPA, that had read Liz's books, Howard's books, and so on. And whilst I could take them to that beginner's level, and I also ran a sort of intermediate class to build them up, it was obvious that, people were looking for a piece of paper, something to say that their peers had judged them and said, this is fine, they're of a good enough standard. And I sort of get that. It's one of those things, I think not everybody wants some people don't want to have a qualification or worry about that too much. But I think it's important for many, many people, particularly in a field like astrology, where we, have a variety of schools, and, it's nice to know where that person has been trained, what they might have learned. So I basically started thinking about the diploma course. And initially I approached Liz to see if she would be interested in running it through the CPA, but maybe taking a little bit of a back seat, and having the other people do it. And I went to her house and had lunch with her. And she said that no, she had enough of that side of things, and she was sort of taking a little bit of a back seat anyway. So as I already had in my head, I said, well, if you don't, do you mind if I do and set up my own school? And she said, well, I'd be delighted and I'm happy to support you. So that's how Mercury Internet School was born, or MISPA was born, really. So I took that. I was very pleased. Liz wrote a letter that we put on the CPA website and our website saying how this was perhaps the next step, the next progression. And I mean, when I spoke to her, her feeling was that she wanted someone who wouldn't just do a carbon copy of what she was doing, but would lead it forward in their own direction. And so, as we'd worked together for some time, luckily she thought that I was the right person to do that, and happy to give her blessing. And she still does webinars for us once a year, which is fabulous. So that's basically how it set up. And then I just set about finding the tutors I wanted. And I took, I approached ones that had already worked for the CPA, but then also students that I'd, studied alongside, that I thought, were ready to take that next step. And so that's what we set up. And then since then, we've sort of expanded and added some other tutors, and we brought in people like Sean Nygaard from the States. And then we have guest tutors coming in as well each term. So that's the way. And I see it as constantly evolving. Tutors will change, that new ones will come in. And I like to go around the sort of conferences around the world and look for people that I think will fit that, where we're coming from, if you like.
Right. Yeah, because you're part of then like a lineage, which is interesting, like the restarting of a modern astrological lineage of astrologers through your school and through that school, the CPA, but even going back maybe even a generation before that. Could we talk a little bit about, on the podcast, I've talked a lot about the origins of modern astrology and the revival of modern astrology in the early 20th century, especially in the first half, but I haven't covered a lot the psychological revival or the focus on depth psychology that really got going in the 1960s and 70s. Do you know a lot of that history, or is that something
it's not a specialist subject of mine or whatever, but I mean, obviously a lot grow out of the work of Leo and Rudyard coming forward. And then it sort of starts, certainly again, becoming focused in, I think, with the work of Liz Greene and Howard. They started teaching when Liz came to the UK in the 80s. And they got together. I mean, they were originally teaching from people's houses and, apartments they could borrow and this type of thing.
And she was a Jungian analyst, and was he as well, or what was his background?
Howard had trained in psychosynthesis. So he'd followed, Saggioli. And obviously that, again, was quite a astrological based psychology.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, many people may know as well that, Liz has since, looked a lot into Jung's work and published a couple of books, in the last few years, one on the Red Book and one on Jung and astrology. And I mean, it's interesting. I don't think it's well known enough how much Jung did use astrology.
Right.
That it wasn't just a case, there are mentions in his books of the astrology experiment, which was like a synastry experiment that he did with his work on synchronicity. But actually, from the research that Liz has done, it's quite obvious that he was doing charts for pretty much all of his clients. And that was going on. His daughter was drawing them up for him because he wasn't particularly good at drawing up the charts. And he was using that. So, there was a lot going on in the background. There are some quotes that I've come across where he sort of then dismisses astrology. There's a few in letters and stuff. But I get the feeling that a lot of that was because he was desperate to be a scientist, desperately to be accepted in that, and didn't want to scupper his chances. But in the background, he was certainly playing around with it and using it with his clients.
Right. So it seems like while we see people as early as Rudyard in the 1930s starting to integrate Jung a little bit, it seems like it's not until people like Liz Greene come along that the full apparatus of Jung's work really gets integrated and synthesized into contemporary astrology in a serious way, right?
Yeah, I would say that's the case. And, certainly with the work of Liz and Howard, that's where it comes into focus. I think some people get a little bit worried sometimes that psychological astrology is all about Jung, if you like. And whilst, his psychology is a very good fit in many ways, for astrology. And I mean, even to the point that I would say that some of his theories are guided from the history of astrology or the workings of astrology. What we're trying to do now is keep abreast of, various different psychologies and what is current that also fits astrology. Not every psychology works particularly well with astrology. But I think, that often people's viewpoint of psychological astrology is it's basically studying Jung, which we certainly do, and we look at that. But, I think it's more, for me, that psychological astrology is a broader thing, which is purely looking at it, when you have interactions between people and when it is focusing on personality of people and what they feel and what they think and what's going on inside. That's a psychological thing. Whether you want to name it after a particular theory is a bit irrelevant, really. It's more
Sure.
about, the slant, if you like, that you're taking.
Sure. So let's talk about that then and define that. I mean, what is psychological astrology and how could we differentiate that from, like, let's say some other form of astrology or some tradition? Like, what is the underlying emphasis that's important to convey if there was a new student of astrology that didn't know what made psychological astrology different from any other approach?
I mean, I think it's the focus is probably on the person's psyche, on their psychology. And so rather than it necessarily, our focus is not necessarily on the prediction of events. It's not that we don't do that, and it's not that we don't look at trends, but we look at from I suppose a process of development. What is going on in this person's life? What is going on in the world out there that is impinging on them, and how might that relate, to their psyche? So I suppose, it's the focus is more on people, and it's more on helping, really, rather than helping them make, say, a decision. Do I buy this house or do I take this job or whatever? It's more about them growing as a person, and that's not in a wishy-washy way either. We tend to go quite deeply when we work long-term with clients, in working them so that, helping them work out through problems that they may have, through complexes in their life, through repetitions that they see in their life, where they keep falling into the same pattern over and over again, and helping them, framing that in an astrological context. So this is a Venus square Saturn thing, but then taking it into the psychological. Well, what does that mean? What Venusian things have been denied by the fact that Saturn is square to it. How's that manifested in their life, which may have come from circumstances, it may have come from treatment by their caregivers or parents or whatever, or relationships they've had. And how can they work with those? How can they get Saturn and Venus to work together better, basically, to go forward and perhaps improve their relating styles and how they are with people, to feel more comfortable in themselves. And, so the focus is helping people become, I suppose, the best person they can be, given the chart, which is, there anyway, and is still sort of part of that. But, we have a flexibility to it. It's not set in stone. Yes, a Venus square Saturn will always be a Venus square Saturn, but by being aware of what it does in your life, I think you can make certain judgments, you can make certain changes in your approach to life that can make that work. You can work alongside it rather than fighting it all the time or falling into the traps of it.
Sure. So using astrology as a tool for self-development and growth rather than just strictly as like a predictive or a divinatory tool for making statements about the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and I think, one of the broader context, I think whenever people work as astrologers, in an awful lot of cases, it is psychological astrology. You may not name it as that, but as soon as you're sitting there with a client, whether you're giving them advice on something they're doing or on a relationship or, telling them something that may be coming up, you're interacting with another person. There's a psychological connection between the astrologer and the client. And so I think it's important that we don't ignore that, whatever astrological work we do. We can't be blasé and just go, well, I'm just telling him what the stars say, or we're just telling him what the astrology says. It's important to think, well, how might that affect that person? What are they like inside? And, sometimes by giving an information, are they going to blindly follow that? Or is it going to, cause them difficulties in other areas of their life? So it's looking at it in a more, I hate the word holistic because it always brings up these sort of images of, perhaps being a bit airy-fairy. But, it's this idea, treating everything together, and making sure that, that we are being careful as astrologers and taking responsibility.
Yeah, that's really brilliant, and something that probably was missing from the tradition up until that point is considering how the astrologer, what the astrologer says will impact the client. And maybe just because you can say something doesn't mean that you should, or that you should be careful how you say it because of the impact it may have.
Yes, I think that's vital, and I think it's one of the things that has perhaps come up, particularly over the last few decades, as there's been this wonderful wealth of translations and rediscovery of old techniques, and it's very easy to get lost in those, and go, well, isn't this marvelous? This is what they did, and these are house systems we hadn't thought of before, and techniques, and going into that, and it's brilliant, and I'm really happy that we're building on this information, but we mustn't lose sight in technique that we're actually providing a service as an astrologer, and we're working with other human beings, and it isn't a closed box. That they have emotions, they have feelings, they have instincts, and so on, that we need to take into account when we're working with them.
Right. So it's not just a matter of just throwing it out and giving it to the client and saying it's up to them how they deal with it, but being really cognizant of how you're presenting that information.
Yes, and knowing how to talk to a client. Certainly at MISPA, what we ask is that students are either undergoing therapy themselves or have done in recent past, and also that they have undertaken at the very least a counselling skills course, because it's not just about being aware, well, this might upset the client if I say that, or whatever. It's about being able to read a client, to listen to them, to hear what they're not saying, but that's going underneath, whether that's through, their body language, or the things they don't say as much as the things they do say. And I think, even just a small amount of training in counselling skills allows us to be better astrologers, because we become aware of how we affect them, the fact that it's an interactive process, the fact that they will put things on us. In psychological terms, that's transference, and then you have countertransference going back. But in simple terms, it's about us being aware that because we are telling them stuff and they're like, well, how does this person know this about my life? That they may see us as, an authority, as a guru or a wizard or whatever, or even, in a parental role, this type of thing. And so you get that transference from them, and it will bring in stuff from their background, how they've been treated by authority in the past, what was their relationship like with those figures. And so, that's coming into the room, whether you like it or not as an astrologer, and you may not want that, but you can't avoid it, because that's how they see it. If you're sitting there, as we probably get quite used to doing, which is, describe, even if we're just describing the personality, or telling them about things in the past, to them, that's a revelation, because we haven't met them, we don't know them. How does this person know that?
Right.
And immediately you've been elevated. And so that's putting something on you. Now, so they may see you in a father or mother role or whatever. Well, depending on their relationship with their father and mother, or people in that position, that may not just be, well, isn't this wonderful, this person's authority? It may be, dad didn't love me enough, or he never respected me, or, mum didn't do this. And so that then gets put alongside it, unconsciously, of course, but it's there in the room. And so we need to be prepared and be able to notice that, and gently, put it back to them. And also be aware of, if they are treating us like that, how we may then respond. How do we respond when we're put in that thing? If someone sees us as an authority figure, do we get inflated? Do we get anxious because we don't want to be put in that position, and then we're putting that back on them? So, it's an important process to understand. And as I said, it doesn't matter what type of astrology you're doing. I think it's something that, an awareness of and an understanding of how to work with is important.
Yeah, just because it puts a tremendous amount of power in the astrologer's hands, but being able to be sure that especially new students of astrology know how to use that wisely, and in a way that's helpful or healing to the client and not the opposite.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I found it very encouraging, actually, that the last few years when I've been to, I went to UAC and did the SOTAR conference in Buffalo and stuff. And I was speaking to a lot of younger astrologers, or younger than, that I necessarily get. And a lot of them had trained, perhaps on your course, or they're working with, traditional techniques, Hellenistic techniques, etc. And when I explained what I did, I was really happy with the openness to it, that it wasn't, I think sometimes you see these things online or, Twitter arguments or what, and it's very easy to think that there's this big battle going on, between traditional and,
Right.
and there doesn't need to be. And I mean, you did a talk at the AA conference just the weekend past, and, we're talking about, a renaissance, of finding, translating old texts, bringing new information, and then a resynthesis of, what had been going on before. And I think that's what we have coming. And I noticed this, so when you actually go out and talk to people, and, I'd explain what I did, and they'd say, well, I think that would be useful to me.
Mhm.
And, I think it's great because we've got a whole generation who have learnt very in-depth techniques, techniques that perhaps students 20, 30 years ago weren't learning. So they've got this, big armory of tools they can use, but they're now looking, well, how do I use that with a client?
Right.
How can I approach that? And realizing that, once you've finished the studying and you're then sitting in a room with someone, that suddenly things change, and you can be very, very sure of, yeah, I think this is this, and that's going to mean that, and whatever. But then when you're presented one-on-one with a person and they're questioning you or asking things, it's very easy to suddenly feel in that awkward position of like, oh, this is a lot of responsibility.
Right.
And so I think, people are now seeing that and so are very open to this synthesis, of, well, I want to use these techniques, but maybe there's stuff we can also learn from the psychological and astrology that's been running, recently. And we can bring that together and find ways of absolutely serving, our clients by using the best techniques that we have at our disposal, and also techniques to make sure that they are okay and that, we're looking after them on a psychological level as well as just an astrological level.
Yeah. I mean, you're not going to find counseling skills in a second century text, whereas
Oh,
modern astrologers have been doing astrology and integrating it with counseling for several decades now, for entire careers, and there's a lot of important accumulated wisdom coming from that. That no matter what tradition or approach you're using, seems important and vital to integrate.
yeah, and I think that's probably the way forward. I mean, I think, and I mean, it's hard to see exactly how it will go, but I can see that, certainly, um, I'm enjoying bringing in some more traditional thoughts and stuff into our psychological school and starting to embrace some of those, and also, sort of investigate them and see, well, how can we apply this in a psychological context? And then, said for people that absolutely want to work traditionally, I think it is important to bring in this idea of, that we are working as counselors, priests, in that role of someone supporting and guiding someone. And so, yeah, I think how the synthesis will go is that, people won't see such a disparity between it, and they'll start to see that yes, there's a way forward which can use the best of both worlds. And, they're not antithetical to one another. They actually can work alongside quite well.
Sure. So if the goal, it sounds like one of the things is that the underlying goal is making sure that astrology is helpful in healing. Um, what are some of the things though then that could be problematic to avoid? We've talked about like transference, and I'm trying to think of other things that are important for astrologers to be aware of, or dynamics that come up in consultations that could be problematic.
Um, I mean, I think there are all sorts of trigger points. I mean, certainly when I teach my, when we look at a consultation, as well as looking at, perhaps the consultation chart, obviously the client's chart, transits, progressions, and, whatever techniques we want to bring in, I will always do a synastry chart between the client and the astrologer.
Okay.
And I think it's important in several ways. One is to check where, are their planets touching trigger points in our chart, and vice versa. So, if they have a very complicated, I don't know, Moon, Pluto, Saturn arrangement in their chart or whatever, which is going to be something you're going to be talking about, something important. Does that touch one of our planets? Are we setting it off? Is our Saturn conjunct? Are we being Saturnian towards that? Are we being, is it our Moon? Is it our Mars or whatever? And to think about, well, how might that approach be coming across? Is that going to be something that's helpful to them, or are we, perhaps if we're not careful, going to go in with a Mars approach and just go, well, it's this, and this, and scare the hell out of them, and take that approach. So that's one thing. Also, vice versa, what's coming back from them. So that if we have one of those complexes, are they touching that? And so inadvertently may start bringing up things in us that's going to affect how we feel about them. Are we going to get on with this client? Are we going to feel comfortable with them, or is it perhaps going to be hard work, or, we're going to feel perhaps, worried that we're not good enough, and all of this type of thing. And it helps to prepare for that and be aware of it. I also look, just for very simple things like the communication between it, even if it's elemental balances, that type of thing, how their Mercury works, this type of thing compared to ours, so how do they take in information? And obviously we can see that in the chart, but, is it a predominantly visual based thing? Is it something based on feelings? Is it based on, logic, and they want to follow a process? So, I think we can then look at that and go, right, well, this is how I should amend my communication techniques to make sure they get the most out of it.
So you will adjust or adapt your approach based on the client?
Yeah. I think it's a useful thing. I mean, I have personal example, Mercury in Aries. So, it's very easy for me to sort of go in there and go, well, I think this, and this, and approach it sort of in a very direct manner, and almost try and, give the client a bit of a kick to go, well, you need to get going on this. And often that works really well. I attract clients that are perhaps ready for that, bit of a boost. But you have to be careful that that's not an approach that, maybe feel intimidating to them, or put them on the spot, or make them feel they should be doing something when actually, obviously, it's always their decision, what they do next. So you may adapt that to put in a more feeling-based mode of how do you feel about that, and sort of reflecting through it with them and getting them to work with it. So that's certainly something I would look at beforehand.
So one of the things that I've noticed with the revival of traditional astrologer and older forms of astrology recently is that it seems like it's making me a little nervous, frankly, is that some new students of astrology are starting with traditional astrology and with that technical approach right from the start, which in some sense I think is good, and it gives them a nice technical basis for astrology. But one of the unintended side effects is they're then skipping over some of the counseling techniques and the background psychology for astrologers that people like myself take for granted already, since that's what we started with first, and that there might be something vital and important about that that shouldn't be skipped over in one's early studies.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, obviously it's easy to, to sort of say, well, this might be a good pathway to follow. But I remember in one of Demetra's books, she sort of mentions the idea that perhaps it's a useful idea, to study a more modern astrology, with the psychological bent first, in that it allows you to understand your role and what you're doing. And also perhaps it initially it can be a little bit simpler to learn because you're not crowding as many techniques and overcoming that. And then obviously once you've got that that basis and that understanding, I mean, you've then got a lifetime to delve into all the areas that you would like, and build up the tools that you would like to do, so you can learn different techniques and follow your interests into areas of astrology that work well. And I would agree that, and as you said, that I know your path was sort of learning a modern and then developing into that. And I think that can be a good. I'm certainly enjoying the sort of freedom that I have now of I can just delve into a technique, learn about it, and say, okay, is that helpful to what I do as an astrologer? Is it something I want to bring in, or is it just something I'll learn? It'll be interesting, and it may not become part of my day-to-day usage.
Sure.
And so I think that can be a useful way of learning astrology. And as you say, it's very easy, I think, to dive into those techniques and get absolutely fascinated. Oh, you can do this, and working out, and you're working out all the Time Lord stuff, and perfections for the year, all of those techniques. And then it can be easy to get lost of well, where do I go with this, and how do I feed it into a sort of one-to-one reading without it being a list of this, and this.
Right.
And so, I mean, certainly one of the things I tell my students is that actually less is more with an actual consultation. In that, when we get carried away with a lot of techniques, or when we spend, weeks and weeks preparing for a client, writing notes or whatever, I always say to them, well, that's fine to do that, but be prepared to not touch, more than about 10% of that when you're actually in the room with them.
Right.
Because the important thing is, one, what does that person need right now? Is it any help for them to know that, this is something to do with their Venus when they're actually worried about a work situation or whatever.
Right.
And so what is relevant for them right now, and also how much can they take in? We're familiar with this language, and we're talking about it in that way. And yet, for them, it's sounding like a huge amount of information coming in at once, and really hard to deal with and know what to do with.
Yeah, the client, the use of language on the part of the astrologer, and how that sounds to a client. I know that that's been a major topic of discussion and focus in the psychological astrological community over the past 2 decades.
Mm. I mean, it's something we always look at, and I think it's important not to get rid of astrological jargon, because we need that jargon to show people we are following rules. We're working this out. And so I like to present them with the chart. And even if they don't understand, I like to say, okay, so, your Venus is here. It's square to Mars. This is what they do. But to ground it in the astrological language, and whatever language, you want to use, but to sort of point out that it's a chart you're following. Because I think the danger, if we skip the jargon altogether, we come across as a medium. We're just knowing this stuff out of thin air. And if that's your particular approach, it's one thing. But I think in general, as astrologers, we want to show that, it is techniques and ancient techniques that we are following and working with that, that we want the client to understand. So I think that's an important thing. But yes, it's also not about not overwhelming them, too much. Do they really need to know, the sect, that it's in detriment or whatever? Sometimes that may not be useful to them. It's great for you to know and to build your interpretation on that. But I think, keeping it slightly simpler, will probably work better for them.
Right. Or even the issue of using what can come off as scary language to the client. Like there was a lot of discussion in the 60s and 70s about the terms benefic and malefic, for example, and their appropriateness in a consulting setting.
Yeah. And, I mean, sometimes it can sound, we use, it's a challenging thing, or it's a growth thing, and sometimes these words can sound almost a little bit too trite or whatever. I think there's a balance to be found. I don't think there's a problem saying, well, actually this can be a little bit difficult for your Mars, but then explaining to them how that might feel. And I think that's the important thing, is translating it to how they might actually, how it might actually manifest in their life. Being told you have a malefic in a sign of its detriment, or what, is quite intense language for someone to take, and isn't really that helpful. Whereas explaining what the outcomes of that might be, so how that Mars doesn't fulfill its task, or leads them astray, or whatever you think it does, that's a far more helpful approach. And then also, I think, an explanation of why that is and how they can work with that, rather than, the danger, I think, when we use language like that, is them feeling, well, this is fated, this is set in stone, I can't escape this. And, I think maybe not all, but most of us, think, well, there are ways you can work better with this. There are ways that you can see it as a tool rather than a constant adversary to what you're trying to do in your life. And so that use of language, I think, is important. And it's always a dialogue worth having. And I think it's something that will probably change over and over again. I think there was a danger from the psychological side of it getting almost too easy. If everything is to do with growth and everything is to do with, well, it might be a challenge. It maybe doesn't appreciate how hard the client might be struggling with this.
Sure.
And certainly, the idea of, a difficult transit or whatever that you're trying to explain, just talking about the meaning of it, well, this is good for growth. And, you'll look back on this and see this as a period. That's no use to a person if they're going through crap.
Sure.
And so I think that I would see also as a psychological, which is empathizing with that client of like, yeah, this is awful. This is a horrible thing to be going through. And you may look back in the future, but right now, this is how it feels. And maybe be able to give them a few techniques, psychological techniques or tips that can help them cope with it. Whether that's, mindfulness or distraction even, for this time that they're doing it. And I think that's the discussion we have. And this is the sort of thing that I think needs to be taught in all courses. I think there is room for how we work with a client in every course. And it shouldn't just be business approach, this is how you can make money out of it, or, a technical approach of what you do, maybe an order that you want to look through a chart and help like that. But it should also be, a thing in every course where this is how you work when there's a real person sitting there who might get upset, who might cry while you're talking to them, which, if you're not used to that, that will really throw you the first time it happens. And it's not that uncommon if you're, touching on things that are very important.
Right. Yeah. It sounds like one of the things you're getting to that's really important here is the focus on not talking necessarily, even though you might list scenarios or possibilities of like a transit that's coming up, talking more about how the person will feel during that time and how such a transit might affect them emotionally as being the most important underlying thing, rather than focusing on trying to predict the specific manifestation.
Yeah. Yeah. That's certainly the angle we come from, if you like. And I often wonder, is it helpful to pin down, well, it will manifest in this way, and perhaps be wrong because we've slightly, we've related it or corresponded it to something that perhaps, it hasn't manifested. Or, is it more helpful to go, this is, a long transit, it's a Pluto transit, or, and this is what many people experience during it. And help them with that, not to scare them, because they probably come to see you when it's already started. Not to scare them, but to say, okay, I understand you're probably feeling like this right now. And you reflect and you wait to listen to, to what they have to say. And explain what the process is. Explain how you can work with the Pluto transit, work with the Saturn transit, and be totally honest. Well, no, it's often quite hard for people, but this is the best way to approach it. And, to get something out of it rather than, be huddled in a corner going, when's this going to end?
Right.
And so that's what I think is important. And again, it comes back to listening to what they have to say as well, validate their experience of it. I mean, people are surprised, if I've done a consultation with them, when they listen back to the audio, they're like, well, I spoke so much. And I'm happy with that. It shouldn't be an hour and a half of me just talking at them.
Right.
It's a dialogue. And that's why I always use the word consultation rather than reading. I want to engage with them. I want to know how it's working for them, and explain, how they can then perhaps work with that and what it means in the greater context of their whole life. And so I need to hear what they have to say. I need to be listening to them and making sure that I understand what they're saying as well. So yes, clients will talk for an awful lot, in my consultations. But I see that as, you wouldn't expect to go to see a doctor and walk in the room and just stand there and go, what's wrong with me? There's got to be that dialogue. Well, I can look at the transit. Okay, it seems like you're going through this. I imagine it feels like this. But you need them to go, yes, that is how it's manifesting in my life, or not. And so that's the thing. It's, that dialogue between. And so I always make sure my clients know before they come, that that's what I'm going to do.
Right. That this is a dialogue, not a lecture.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, in my view, a lecture is no help to you. We've all been to lectures, and sometimes we'll take some of that stuff in, but, it's only got to push us in a certain way or feel uncomfortable, or even just not quite feel, well, that's not quite what I'm experiencing. I understand what you're saying, but it's not quite how I am. Well, they need that opportunity to go, well, I'm feeling it like this. And then you can look at the chart and go, oh, actually, no, maybe that's bringing that in as well. It's bringing in that Mars aspect that may be a bit wide, but maybe that is how it works in their life.
So the dialogue helps you to focus it and narrow in on things and maybe even clarify things so that you can have a sharper discussion and interpretation of the things that are relevant to them.
Yeah. Yeah. To make it about them. It's not about me showing them how much I know about astrology. That's hopeless to them.
Right.
It's about them and how they feel. And so, I think, that's the way I like to work with people. And I think it probably allows the best results. It's one of those things, I think, when we've just finished studying, we can be quite nervous about what we know, what we don't know, and we're not used to preparing a chart and this type of thing. It can be very easy to be overwhelmed and think, I've got to impress this person. I've got to show them how much knowledge, I've got to just launch into a whole diatribe, if you like, about this is what I know. So they'll go, oh, wow. It isn't about the astrologer. It isn't about you as that person. It's about them.
There's something kind of like egoic. I don't know if that's the right term for that a tendency that sometimes astrologers have, especially newer students. And what's important about your saying is just needing to reorient that away from yourself and your anxiety or what have you to them and what they actually need at that moment.
Yeah, I think it's easy. I'm not criticizing. I think we all go through that
Sure.
thing of, there's that need. We're worried. We want them to like us. We want them to be, go, yes, you're absolutely right. We need that feedback in order to feel that what we've learned hasn't been in vain. So I'm not knocking that. It's just about becoming aware of that and realizing that actually you're really not that important in the process. You are sowing seeds, if you like. You're sowing ideas, of this may be what you're feeling, and allowing them to work with that and to come back to you with their experiences. So then you can go deeper. I mean, let's address this here. One of the criticisms often of psychological astrology is that we use really big orbs. Not just in a natal chart, we use them for transits or whatever. And most people say, how can you use a 10-degree orb for a Pluto transit?
Okay, so 10 degrees, that's considered really big?
I've certainly been criticised in the past
Okay.
for using, orbs that big. Now I appreciate you look back at some of the traditional ones, and it's when it enters a sign, and so I think we're starting to revise that through our studies. But the way I've always, psychologically, you think of a big change in your life, which say a Pluto transit to the Sun is,
Right.
um, that doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah.
You feel a shift in things coming years before. You're starting to change. I'm not sure I want to do that anymore. I'm not sure I like that anymore. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with this relationship anymore. And it builds up and builds up, and then maybe a couple of things happening when it's closer, and then it moves away. Well, it doesn't finish when it moves away. It's still there, and often that's the process where you're working through and saying, "Oh, now I see," because you've made that change in your life, and then you're then coming to terms with that and seeing how you've changed as a person. So from those first feelings of, sound of drums in the distance to going, "Oh yeah, no, I've really changed over," and you look back and go, "Yeah, that's when I changed." That's the process of that whole period.
Right, because sometimes, well, there can occasionally be like an event around the exact degree, let's
Yeah.
say, for the sake of argument. Oftentimes, you're looking at it more from the standpoint of like a developmental process, which is usually a much longer term sequence of events.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, as you say, there may be, an event or two along the way, or a push of something. Maybe, I don't know, you leave a partner, or you decide to move, or and those add into it. But that's not the process. It's not about that moment in time that something happens to you or you do that. A simple thing, an accident. Well, yeah, the accident is that moment, but your behaviour up to that may have helped cause that accident, and how you then adapt to what happened to the accident comes after. So it's still that period of a process, isn't it? So, that's the way to look at it. But as you say, it used to be a criticism of psychological astrologers of these vast orbs, but I think it is shifting.
Yeah, I love that the traditional take astrologers will now take that criticism now, and you guys are kind of off the hook a little bit. Well,
Exactly. How can you look at it when it just goes in there?
Right.
But no, I agree with it. And I was pleased, so looking through some of the older texts of going, well, yeah, they recognise that this isn't it's not all about what might happen when this is here, but that it's a long-term thing.
Right. And that's actually really great from a technical standpoint. I almost want to say one of the greatest technical innovations of late 20th century psychological astrology is to look at transits as cycles of development and looking at most things as cycles of development. So that looking at like the Saturn return and looking at that within the context of the entire Saturn cycle and the important turning points during the course of it,
Yeah.
as well as other long-term cycles like the Uranus squares and opposition and things like that. That's very important, I would assume, to your work, at least in terms of transit analysis.
Absolutely, yeah. We're looking at, that idea of, that something starts at that conjunction point, start of a cycle. So at birth, and then, the next Saturn return, if we take Saturn as an example. Yeah. And then you're looking at those big points along it and seeing it as a process going through. So, something is started at that Saturn return, if you like. And it's usually, with Saturn, it's usually a checkpoint. Am I happy with where things are? Do I feel that I've achieved something, or am I beating myself up for having failed totally at what I planned, or thought I had in my head to do? And then you've got these checkpoints. So, you maybe feel comfortable at the sextiles and trines that you're working at something, and, that you decided then. But then at the squares and the oppositions, you're getting those challenges, or someone's blocking you, or you're blocking yourself by feeling doubts or worrying that you've done the wrong thing, and this type of thing. And so seeing that as a whole process, and looking back at that point, well, what happened last time this happened, and looking back in those periods of 7 years ago for the last square, or 29 years ago for the last time it was there, this type of thing. So it's a constant checking through and working with that. And I like working with the cycles because they're constants in people's life, for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So they're very useful tools for students because, whereas transits will happen depending on where that person's planets are, you get very used to seeing clients coming around their Saturn return or around, the Uranus opposition, the Neptune square, things like that. These are big points in people's lives. And I think that's interesting, and it's useful as when you're starting out working with clients to recognize those. And people find it incredibly helpful just to go, you're not alone in this.
Right.
Everyone of your age is going through this, and you've probably got friends, if you're still in touch with people who say, that have done this, that are happy because they've achieved something, or are suffering depression because they feel like their life's a mess and their 30s coming up, and all of that type of thing. And the same with the sort of mid-40 ones. Even just telling people that they're not alone, and explaining the process can be incredibly helpful to people.
Mm.
And they don't necessarily need to know all the ins and outs of what might happen, but just going, oh, that's good. I thought it was just me.
Right. And that in and of itself, when you go through and talk about a person's past and you use the past to predict and anticipate the future, becomes like a technical approach, but also that becomes your way of demonstrating the astrology is working in a way that's a little bit safer by showing them how it's worked out in their past rather than just making a prediction that's unverifiable in the present about their future.
Absolutely. And it's useful to say, what were you doing 7 years ago? What was happening then? And then you can say, well, that was the opposition. You're now at the square. Can you see similar themes cropping up? And, that one, yes, you're validating astrology for them because they're going, oh, yeah. But two, you're giving them something helpful. And I mean, when it is a difficult transit, or one you might struggle with, it's useful to be able to look back and go, yeah, that was tough, but I got through it.
Right.
It worked out okay. And for all of us, that can be a useful thing, just to know I've come through the other side.
Right.
It's like if you suffer from depression or something like that, knowing that you've been through it before and come out and had a period of years where you felt fine again, and maybe you've slipped into it, depression again, but at least well, I did it before. It takes time, but then you see the light at the end of the tunnel and you do come out. And I think things like that are helpful for people. They're not particularly, they may be based in astrology, but just knowing the way people work, knowing how people's psychology works is helpful in our work with them. And you're not saying, this transit will be over, but helping them with the psychological process of it.
Yeah, there's something reassuring about that in a sense.
I think people do find reassurance that they've done something before. It's like a stupid example, but you may be frightened about doing a bungee jump, but once you've done a bungee jump, you either you survived,
Right.
and you either enjoyed it or you didn't. So the next time you do it, you might be standing there still very frightened, but
Right.
it was fine before. Off you go.
Yeah.
So I think it's just part of how we work as people. But
That's a great analogy. I'm trying to think of which transits I might like into a bungee jump, maybe a Saturn transit or Uranus transit.
probably a Uranus one. I can feel like that sometimes.
Right. So, in terms of modern psychology, one of the contributions, of course, was the work of Freud, and that contributed a lot in terms of discussions of psychology. And some of that's still used to some extent today, and some of it's not as much. One of the criticisms I think that we've talked about that sometimes other astrologers or other traditions level at psychological astrology is there being too much focus on the parents or dynamics within the family as something that's a great focus in that approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting one, and I mean, obviously, the Freudian approach, of Oedipus complexes and Electra complexes and stuff like that, are very much that sort of focus on, almost comes down to it's all the fault of the parents. That, whilst certainly we look at the family dynamics within psychological astrology, because it is important within our relationships. We learn how to relate or how not to relate from that very early stage, purely with our interactions with family. And it's not just mum and dad, it's siblings, aunts, uncles, neighbours, all of that type of thing gets brought in.
And maybe we should just establish like that's true. I mean, that is an important
Yeah.
and was not necessarily a thing in astrology prior to the 20th century. While you might identify things about the parents or siblings or family members, like talking about the effect of those relationships on the native psychology and their future life choices, that's a huge and very important contribution we should establish in psychological astrology.
Yeah. I mean, as I said, I think there's a balance, if you like. And I think one of the criticisms, and not of just psychological, but of psychology, is this idea of blaming. Blaming the parents, and so therefore, sort of escaping any blame yourself. But it all being the fault of your parents. I mean, you've got the poem "They fuck you up, your mum and dad," which is the classic sort of thing that it's passed on from generation to generation. But the way we tend to approach, is that this is an image of mum, of dad, of siblings, and it's not just what they did. It's not about them. The description in the chart is not just saying, well, this is what they were like, but how your perception of them was.
Okay.
Because we all work through our filters of perception, and we filter things through our chart, as we do as astrologers as well. And so therefore, that it may be that the needs of the client sitting in front of you, maybe you see they've got a moon in Cancer square Uranus, for example. And so it could be that they saw mum as that moon, and so being clingy and, wanting to hold them and keep them in the family. And they feel the Uranus part of the square, and it's like, this is too much. I feel stifled. Mum was stifling. She was oppressive, and this type of thing. Or it can work the other way, which is that mum's doing the Uranian thing and going, well, you cope, you get on with that. I'm doing my own thing. And, the client is sitting there with the Cancer moon going, well, actually, I need some contact here, and you're not giving me enough contact that I wanted. And so that's not a blame on anything. It's not that it's a bad mother or, whatever. It's just that there was a disconnect between the needs of the person and how their parents worked with that. And I think that, that's an important way to work with it, of not, well, this is what your mum did, bad mother, you're blameless, but to talk about the expectations of the client from the structure of their chart. What are they looking for? Because that's going to carry through when they start dating, or having having work relationships, etc. All of those patterns are going to pop up again, and those expectations will be there. So that, the father that abandoned you becomes, well, the boss that never helps you and you're carrying all the responsibility, or, the partner that also always seems to abandon you. And it's important to address, the client is part and parcel. You can't take it out, and it's not a blame game. But yes, all those early relationships are very, very important. And I mean, one of the things that I've sort of been working with more and more, is the idea of narrative. The stories that we tell ourselves. And, whilst, say, Freudian analysis, Jungian analysis spends an awful lot of time sitting, perhaps going through all these past patterns and talking about, the things, that perhaps one of the more modern techniques is how can we rewrite things? Actually, it's not modern because the Stoics did it, but, that idea of taking it from a different perspective and what is in your control and what isn't. But that idea of narrative is, well, here is a story, and it is a story. The story of your life is not the truth. You'll tell it one version. You've been told stuff by, your aunts, your uncles, your parents, of what you were like as a child, and you take that for gospel. You were a naughty child, or you were such an angel as a child. And, you take that and go, well, I must have been that. I don't remember that. And that becomes part of your story. And we build it up over time, what teachers say to us, what partners say to us, what we're telling ourselves as our own internal dialogue. And you can see those patterns within the chart. This is likely to be the story they tell themselves. And so therefore working with that, allows you to go, well, hang on a minute. maybe this needs reframing. Maybe we can tell a different story. And it's amazing how just a shift of focus within that idea of how you view yourself, rather than being the victim, how can we rewrite that story? And I mean, no, it's not overnight, and it takes time, and it takes working with a counselor to do that. But, to change that. And as astrologers, I think we can work with that quite well, because we've got those, archetypal planetary patterns within the chart. We know what Saturn is likely to crop up in as a story as. We know what Mars will turn up as. We know what the moon might be. And so you can look at those and go, well, okay, how might that work differently? If they actually had a conversation, or they actually tried to compromise a bit, and you can get the client to work with, a different idea. And I said, it's not a magic fix for things. It's something that takes time, but I think it is a useful adjunct. And, I see our role as an astrologer often is a storyteller. We're colluding with them in their story, but we also have that, I think, ability as a sort of narrator of their story to say, well, hang on, could you look at that differently? Is there another way of that story ending or being? And I think that can be very useful. And so that's why I'm talking about, we mustn't stand still on the psychology of things. It's worth bringing in new ideas, new ways that psychologists as a separate thing are working at. And I mean, I think it's one of those things, it's very easy for, if you study a subject inherently, it's very easy to get locked into that bit of it. So I study Hellenistic astrology, so I'm just going to read the books on that. And it happens in science. Biologists read biology books. They don't necessarily read physics stuff.
Right.
And so it can be hard when you have these crossovers, and I think it's important that we're all open to what's going on everywhere. So changes in the world, whether it's in AI, whether it's in robotics, are going to affect all of us. And they're going to affect us as astrologers. They're going to affect people as psychologists. They're going to affect, jobs, so many fields of life, that it's important, I think, that we don't just focus our attention on, well, this is what interests me, and it's just that we, read widely. And so, that's why I encourage my students, you've got to read traditional texts as well as, the psychological text, but you should also be reading psychology journals and, look at astrological ones, but don't lose sight of what's happening in the world, or what films are coming out, or what, popular culture is doing. I think it's all feeds in, and it's important. And I think as astrologers, that's part of our role. We need to be able to take an overview of everything. And yes, we're framing it with what's going on in the sky, but, within those charts and what's going on now, we have that understanding of, well, this is probably going to be a trend. This is probably going to be what the next films are about,
Right.
and this type of thing. So we're uniquely placed, I think, better than a lot of other professions to do that. So I think we should embrace that role and make sure that we fit in that as sort of, citizens of everything, or people that are interested in everything, and not just narrow everything down.
Yeah, plus it's such a broad field that it's too much for any one person to master in a single
Yeah,
lifetime. So the only way around that is to talk with and network with practitioners from other specialty areas that might have spent a lifetime focusing on something that you just can't get that deep into, but you can still learn from some of the nicer things that they've discovered.
absolutely. And I think that's what's so beautiful about what's happening in astrology at the moment, is that, I think, we're at a good point in time where we have experts in so many different fields of it, that, it's just about networking and talking and seeing what is of use to you, but also appreciating what others are doing as being useful to the practice as a whole.
Sure. And so there are 2 points really quickly as we start to get towards the end of this that I just wanted to bring up. Maybe we could circle back to. One of them is I loved how you talked about how the perception of different family members, especially the parents, on the part of the native or the individual may not necessarily reflect how that person is objectively or to like other observers, and the important way in which the birth chart can sometimes color or at least show how the native's perception of those individuals in their life is colored in different ways. And then the second one further back was just there was a statement you were making about describing instead of the concrete specifics or trying to predict the concrete specifics, instead how the person might feel emotionally during a transit. And it almost seemed like what is happening there then is it's getting closer to describing the archetype in some sense, which might itself not be something you can articulate, but describing the emotion is probably a lot closer to describing the archetype than attempting to describe the many different possible concrete manifestations.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go back to the first, the
That's
first
the
one
one.
first.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think the idea of the perception there, I mean, if you take a very simple example, if you have brothers or sisters, most likely, their moon aspects, their sun aspects, or, whatever you use to denote mum and dad, house cusp, are going to be in different signs and make different aspects. And if you talk to a sibling, I know I have a very different view of my dad than my sister did. And it's like, well, therefore, which is true.
Right.
And we're back to this narrative again as well. But which is true? And the answer is, well, they both are. But it's just that, my sister's set of patterns in her chart says, okay, you adored dad when you were little. And then as you got older, you found him difficult. You found him, obstructing you and this type of thing. And it shifted, whereas mine was perhaps more constant throughout my life. And it wasn't necessarily a close relationship, but it was, it was fine. It was easy. We got on. There wasn't any specific big problems. And so, you can look at that within charts. It's why it's always interesting to compare charts of family members and to, talk with sets of people in a family. But I think immediately that shows, well, that, those characteristics in that chart are not therefore just describing what dad was like, what mum was like.
Right. There's this interesting sort of like relativism to it then that's almost inherent in astrology.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think it's quite fascinating. And, it is that thing. It can be interesting, if you're working with someone over a period of time to say, if you can get permission from their brother or sister to look at their chart as well. And, well, how did they see your mum? And what was different, and bring out, and then you bring out the relationship between the siblings. Was there jealousy there because mum seemed to prefer this one over that one? And you can unlock these family patterns. And as I said, it's not about getting hung up on that family pattern, but it's then relating that idea of, well, if you're jealous of your sister, how does that relate to your female friends? Or at least of ones that remind you a bit of your sister, or work colleagues, etc. And in unpicking those, it can really help that person go, actually, you know what? Julie at work isn't that bad. She just reminds me of my sister, but she's not really like that. And it's all, again, the projections that we're putting onto people. And suddenly your life at work is much easier because you're not worried about what Julie from accounts is saying about you every day.
Right. Yeah, so that seems really important as an aspect of things. And we were getting into that discussion because you brought up earlier before we recorded just that you felt like sometimes there was a criticism that psychological astrology was too focused on family or parental dynamics.
Yeah, I think that, and again, it depends on people, but I think it's been a criticism, as I said, of psychology itself as well. It's all about going back into your past and looking at that.
Sure.
But as you said, it's about not losing sight that, yes, that is incredibly important within relationships, but also, we're not just focusing on that, but we're turning it back to the client and going, well, how do you feed into this? What are you expecting from life? And it's one of the interesting, to sort of lead into the second part, you look at, say, parental significators in the chart that have outer planet, there, or even some of the, Jupiter, Saturn as well. But, there's an archetypal thing to mum and dad, because, it's not just about your mum and dad, it's about your perception of, what the archetype of mum and dad is. And then following from there, whether your real mum and dad actually managed to fit into that. And the chances are that, if you do have that, perhaps when they were little, yes, they did play that role. But then as you get older, you've realized that, well, actually they've become human, and they're no longer that. They're no longer, dad isn't Saturn or mum isn't Pluto. But, that archetypal thing can linger over it, so that, even though we perhaps recognized mum as human, it still hangs over a bit in relationships. Or it can be that, as can be the case sometimes with an absent parent, maybe a parent dies or a parent leaves. If you have, say, a sun Neptune that sees the father as being this sort of all-embracing, Neptunian figure, and there's no real dad to bounce that off of and to sort of correct that and have it come back down to earth, then the chances are when you go into relationship, well, you're still looking for this God and not a real person. And so bringing stuff like that and sort of gently working with the client on that allows them to then, if you like, come back down to earth and have more realistic expectations of what they want in a relationship and how that might work.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And then also, as we're getting towards the end of this, so that final point just about how there's something about describing the way a person will experience the emotions of a transit, especially a long-term transit, as being almost more archetypal than the specific manifestations, which can be so numerous that it's sometimes very difficult to pick up on the specific one, whereas you can articulate an emotion, and that will cover such a range of ground that in some ways that's more personal and is going to be more accurate than a specific manifestation.
Absolutely. I think if you take something like a Neptune transit, it's going to take a long time. It's going to depend on each individual client as to how well they cope with Neptune in their own chart. It's not just for everybody, but that feeling of Neptune, if you're not familiar with it, can be very overwhelming. You can feel lost. You can suddenly find yourself wandering about the streets, even though you know the area, and go, well, where am I? And whilst, yes, there could be an actual manifestation, your basement gets flooded, something very, we can go, oh, yes, Neptune, something like that.
Right.
It's actually not that important with regards to the person's life. It's the process of what is going through, what is Neptune about and how does that affect, most people, and therefore what might they be feeling and what might they need to be looking at in their life in order to, to come to an understanding with it and to work with it.
Right. How is that affecting you internally, and therefore how is that affecting your overall developmental process?
Yeah. Yeah. And what's it almost, what's it teaching you? What can you learn from this process, if you like? Yes, there may be good things happen, there may be bad things, again, if you take the Neptune, you might absolutely fall in love with someone, but then find, it crumbles, you put them on a pedestal and they're not the person you thought. There can be all these manifestations of it. But what is this process? What are your dreams, if you like? What are you holding close to yourself in a Neptunian sense? And how might they have to be reassessed? What is important to sort of allow to drift away and boundaries broken down, and what is important to still carry on with,
Yeah, so maybe the difference between saying, like, with the Neptune seventh house or Venus transit, like, you will fall in love with somebody and over idealize them and become disillusioned, versus saying, looking internally and saying, perhaps there's a tendency that you're having during this time to put people on a pedestal, and that's something that might be worth acknowledging and looking into in yourself as something that you haven't fully worked out yet, but it might be time to at this time.
Absolutely. Because I don't think it helps, if you take that exact example, if I see them with it coming up, if I say to them, well, you may fall in love, but be careful around it, because they may not be what they seem.
Right.
That's no help to them, is it? Because, as probably all of us know, when you fall in love, you don't take notice of advice like that. I'm in love with, oh, this is an amazing person. So you're never going to listen to it.
Right.
You're never going to hear it. And so, to talk about the process and to maybe say, yeah, this may affect your romantic life or, whatever, and just subtly bring it in. But also to say, maybe it is about, what you're looking for. Look at those expectations, and to feed it back rather than, well, this could happen as an event that you then move on from. Well, has this happened to you before?
Right.
Have you ever fallen in love? And then months later, you're like, oh, that person was terrible. That was the wrong person. Do you think that might be partly within you? And then look at those prior relationships and look at perhaps parental relationships. Where does that come from?
Right.
And talk about how that might be worked with and how that might be part of this longer process of a Neptune transit. And I think that's far more helpful to anyone than saying this could happen.
Yeah, and acknowledging the parts of a person's life that are, especially recurring events that are in some ways of their own creation, even if that's not everything, and there's things that are outside of our control, that there are sometimes things that we bring about in our lives through the unconscious, or just through not being aware that those are dynamics that we're manifesting, and helping the client to identify them.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think we spoke about that when I talked about my synastry book with you on the podcast. But yes, that thing, the repeating patterns is such a huge part, I think, of people's lives. And we all catch ourselves in, why is that happening again, or why did I fall for the same type of person again, or whatever. And it's very easy to get into that fated way of thinking of like, well, this always happens, rather than go, why?
Right.
Why does it always happen? And is there something I can do about it? Or is there something I haven't understood about myself that could actually change that? And I mean, that's the lovely thing about doing this work, is to be able to very gently present it to the person, and sometimes see that realization that, oh, actually, maybe, the partner that leaves you isn't always because they're a terrible person, but almost because actually there's a part of you that needs a lot of freedom in relationships that you haven't acknowledged yet. And that's something you've got to work in, and discuss with potential partners. Okay, I need a lot of space. Do you need a lot of space too? And talk things through, rather than it always be, this always happens to me, my life's terrible.
So it's almost like that's identifying, if there's such thing as fate, that's the fate, is that tendency towards those predispositions, but then the focus becomes actualizing your potential, or your free will, if you want to call it that, to potentially break out of some of those, or at least negotiate them differently than you might if you weren't paying attention.
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember the exact quote, but there's the Jung quote, of what isn't made conscious, appears to us as fate. And that's what happened, and so because it seems to always be happening, we go, oh, my life is fated. And, it's an interesting one to play with, always an ongoing discussion with astrology about fate and free will, etc. But, I think it's an important adjunct to that. Are we creating our own fate by not becoming conscious of these things? And so I think that plays into it. And it's actually quite a nice way of working with the chart, in that it actually incorporates a little bit of both.
Brilliant. Well, I feel like that's a really good stopping point. Where can people find out more information if they want to study with you or learn more about psychological astrology?
Okay, well, our website, so we're called MISPA, and the website is mercuryinternetschool.com.
Okay. And then you also have a personal, like a consulting site, right?
Yes, I'm at psychologicalastrology.com.
Psychological
It's
astrology.
a lot to type in, but
That's perfect. It's easy to remember. And then finally, you have written a book, which we did an interview about previously. I can't remember what episode it was, but you've written a book on synastry.
That's right. Yeah, it's called Do You Love Me? And available from the usual places.
Okay, fine bookstores everywhere.
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thanks a lot for joining me today.
Thank you ever so much, Chris. Enjoyed it.